Now to our cover story, and this week we take you into the arid heart of Australia in search of buried treasure, not Lassiter's legendary lost reef, not gold of any kind. This treasure consists of relics from one of the most famous, some would say infamous, explorations in Australia's history, the Burke Wills expedition.
It's hard to imagine a more desolate place in Australia than the region 90 kilometres northeast of Birdsville in Queensland's remote Channel Country. It's a land of heat and flies, wind and saltbush and not much else. Sitting on the edge of an ironstone gibber plain, water is scarce and food scarcer. In the past 3 years, however, for about a week at a time, it's been home to a disparate collection of Australians who have been looking in a very systematic and sensible way for treasure. Nearly 150 years ago, on April 3rd, 1861, Australia's most famous explorers, Robert O'Hara Burke, William John Wills, Charles Grey and John King, came through here. They were returning to Cooper's Creek, 400 kilometres to the south, where they expected their 7-month ordeal to be over. The explorers had fulfilled their mission, reaching the Gulf of Carpentaria and beating the hard-as-flint South Australian John McDouall Stewart in what had become known as the Race Across Australia. It was a race that captivated a nation. The problem was they were suffering badly. The day they arrived at this nondescript creek, one of their 3 remaining camels had given up and they had left it behind. Already their bodies were wasting away and they were starving. Some months later, the only survivor of the 4, John King, told a royal commission in Melbourne that Burke had ordered the 27-year-old Wills to bury his equipment at this creek to lighten their load as they made a desperate attempt for Cooper's Creek. Wills buried the tools of his navigational trade, chronometers, sextants and an artificial horizon. People have been trying to find the long-lost camp, Camp R47, and its treasure ever since. When Burke, Wills, King and Grey arrived here, they were in dire straits. They had travelled the best part of 4,000 kilometres and they were averaging about 20 kilometres a day. They had almost run out of food. They were living on dried camel meat and a local plant which they picked and they boiled up. Crucially, they were down to 2 camels and Burke's beloved horse Billy. From here, the party had to travel 400 kilometres south to Cooper's Creek, a journey that would take another 18 days. Billy was on his last legs. 6 days into that journey, they shot him and they ate him. A day or so later, Grey died. That was the beginning of the end.
They left the dig tree with 3 months' rations, and they were fairly well aware that it was a 4-month trip. So if you leave with 3 months' rations on a 4-month trip, you know you're going to be hungry. And in fact, they reached a time when their bodies were eating their bodies, in effect. There's no way that they could have survived much longer. They were really in extreme, demonstrated by the fact that Grey died.
In the past 3 years, 80-year-old former Victorian Surveyor General Ray Holmes has come to this remote area 4 times, bringing friends and family to look for Camp R47 and Wills instruments.
Wills was an expert. He was a meticulous surveyor, and it would have been very difficult for him to give up that equipment and to bury it. He didn't give up his barometer or his thermometer. He continued to take 2-hour barometric pressures almost up to the time he died. He had a compass and took that with him. He wouldn't have parted with that because that kept him on track and it was something he could carry in his pocket. I believe there's no doubt that he intended to come back himself or send someone back within a few weeks to pick up this equipment.
The problem was that no one ever returned. Both Burke and Wills died later on Cooper's Creek, and the real location of the camp and Wills' equipment departed with them. The challenge that modern-day prospectors have had is that Wills' watch was not keeping good time, drifting some 24 seconds between Cooper's Creek and the Gulf of Carpentaria. This was a common problem among early explorers. Accurate longitude readings require accurate timekeeping, and the timepieces of the day were not up to the task. 1 second of time equals 460 metres of longitude, so, for many decades, people have been looking for the camp 10 kilometres in the wrong direction. In the end, Ray Holmes used good old-fashioned surveyor's logic and common sense.
Ray was telling us stories out of the diary and out of the Royal Commission, and it dawned on him one night at the campsite that he could do the dead reckoning from a point further north for Wills' travels, and could work out exactly where he felt that Wills crossed the creek. And so he was determined, at the point that at the end of our trip that we'd found nothing, he found new hope and was determined to work that out and to come back again and to locate the tree.
Wills started here and for some reason turned southeasterly. When I plotted that over a modern map, it was obvious that he turned southeasterly to follow down Umperdaboo Creek, and that gave us the clue that we were looking too far downstream and had to come further upstream, which led to finding Plant Camp.
It shows to me the sign of a very practical surveyor, someone who's spent many years on the ground trusting another surveyor's logbook. I've worked with Ray doing a bit of chain work for him. That logbook is vital to him, and what the surveyor writes in there must be right, and I think that's what Ray went on. He just said the information is there.
And so, on the 4th of July last year, they hit pay dirt.
We started looking for metal around any tree, and the first thing we found was Billy's horseshoe. Actually, my granddaughter and myself found it, and 5 minutes after we found it over there, my granddaughter Emma said, "Here's the tree we've been looking for," and she found the blaze on the tree. So when we found the horseshoe and the blaze, we said, we've only got to search around here and we'll get the whole plant. We found it. We searched around here for hour after hour, nothing. There's no doubt in my mind that this is the horseshoe from Burke's horse, Billy. It's interesting that it is worn through and has fallen apart at the tip. That's a real pointer as to its origin. No cattleman would ever let his horse's shoes get to this state.
But how to find the rest of Wills' equipment? Holmes's knowledge of hydrology, the science of water on land, provided the answer.
When there's a big rain, it would probably be a thunderstorm. In the catchment, a small catchment, very fast runoff, very steep gradient, so the water would pour down here, cut and fill, and keep changing the whole environment. As soon as we knew the equipment had gone from here, we went right down to the delta area where I knew that the gradient would flatten out and the water would start to drop its load and accordingly drop any instruments it was carrying. That's exactly where we found the bubble.
When the bubble was found, my son-in-law came running towards Ray with it and said, "We've found something, we've found something." And Ray picked it up and he looked at it and he said, "I think we need to ask a Surveyor General what this is." And my son-in-law looked at it and said, "I think you were one of those, weren't you?" And Ray smiled and said, "Yes, we've found Burke and Wills' equipment." It was just a moment that everyone will remember.
The so-called bubble is an important piece of surveyor's equipment, a bit like a large spirit level in a brass case, which Wills used to level his artificial horizon.
It was clearly mid-19th century because these graduations are hand-scribed, and that stopped late last century.
Finally, here was irrefutable proof that this was the long-lost camp.
Obviously a very old bubble. I'm quite amazed that the bubble survived rolling down the creek, and there's no one out here who would ever have used that bubble other than Wills.
The bubble now rests in a safe place in Melbourne. During Holmes's most recent trip, early last month, his team of relatives and friends unearthed yet more artefacts.
What do you think?
I don't know. It's great to find another one.
Bullets and caps from the mid-1800s, brass hinges, a pair of scissors, most likely from the explorer's medical kit, but despite prolonged searching, they've been unable to locate the surveyor's holy grails, the sextants or the chronometers. They may be underground, below the reach of even the most modern of metal detectors, or they may be somewhere else.
I think there's a strong possibility that it's still buried upstream somewhere. On the other hand, given all the stuff we've found downstream, if there's been a wash away, they're heavy objects, they would glisten in the sun, they're not going to be, you know, easily covered. A stockman or someone could have found them 50 or 80 years ago. They could be sitting in a homestead somewhere on someone's mantelpiece without anyone necessarily realising what they are.
Because this country would have been traversed by stockmen.
That's right, the brass.
And what does an ageing surveyor do with historic artefacts worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars? He doesn't want to keep them and he doesn't want to sell them. He's going to give them to the State Library of Victoria, the state from which this whole extraordinary Burke Wills expedition began.
Which is where there is a permanent display of Burke Wills artefacts, and we've spoken with the library, they'll be happy to receive them. I'm slightly a parochial Victorian, so I would like it to go to the Victorian state, but in the longer term it's Australian.
The expedition that started in Melbourne in August 1860 with 28 horses and wagons, 24 camels, 20 camp beds, 6 tons of firewood, even a dining room table, ended here 10 months later on remote Cooper's Creek in what is now southwest Queensland. Both Burke and Wills died here, probably 2 or 3 days apart, we're not quite sure. Victoria's former Surveyor General has his own thoughts on what were clearly 2 very different individuals.
I'm beginning to feel that I've lived with Wills over a number of years now and know him quite well. The thing that comes through was that he was an outstanding navigator. He was ideally suited for the task. He appeared to get on well with people, although he did get a bit offside with Gray at one stage. Burke was a strange character. I've always felt with Burke that if the committee was looking for someone who would go to the Gulf and make it and achieve that, whether he killed all these people on the way or not, then Burke was a good selection. If you really wanted to get there, examine the country and come back with a report, Burke was anything but a good selection. He was not a good planner. He rushed forward. And I don't think this was all his fault. The committee had to bear some of the blame for that. They pushed him to get there ahead of Stewart, who was reputedly moving north from South Australia up from Adelaide. And there was a £2,000 prize swinging on who got there first. And also Burke had an extreme sense of personal profile. He wanted to come back as a hero. And of course he achieved it, but it wasn't through coming back.
Holmes says that his discovery and the fact that he was able to retrace Wills's plottings from the north vindicates Wills and restores a reputation that has come in for a battering. Fellow explorer Ernest Giles called Wills an amateur. Another explorer, A.C. Gregory, at the time the Surveyor General of Queensland, laid the blame for the disaster firmly at Wills's feet, saying he was often more than 150 kilometres away from his intended route.
He was criticised for claiming he was on a different river when he got to the Gulf. But in fact, if you look at the records, it was very dubious as to whether the criticism was justified. It's clear that when you look at how he had plotted his campsites and fixed a latitude for them, and then compare them with modern survey techniques, that he was within a couple of 100 metres most of the time. He knew exactly where he was. He drifted a little east and west, but very little away from the 140th meridian, which he'd been told to go up. So he kept the party exactly where he was supposed to take them.
Ray Holmes, currently in his 9th decade, has said that this is his last trip, but concedes he could be convinced otherwise.
I've done a fair bit. You never know, I could be persuaded again by my sons-in-law, but I feel I've done enough. I've achieved what I set out to do, and so it closes up at that time. They'll eventually be found, I believe, but it will take a great deal of perseverance, a great deal of hard work, probably by a lot of people. We've done a lot of work ourselves. We've searched a lot of the creek.
Look, he's saying that this is probably his last trip, but I don't believe that for 1 second. I think we've got some theories that we'll continue to pursue, and he'll be back.
He's stubborn, definitely is the first thing that comes to mind. And his persistence is really what's drove him to come out here, to keep coming out here. His age, the 80, others would have, I think, given up well before. It's difficult being out here, it's not easy, and yet he keeps coming back.
What a great yarn. Richard Allen with our cover story, and a fascinating thought that Wills' equipment could be on a mantelpiece somewhere in the suburbs. Up next, Laurie Oakes talks with the Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon about his meetings this week with military officials in the United States.